Good morning and welcome to RECHARGE's third and final edition of the Virtual Roundtable discussions. I'm the moderator, Catherine Sheridan, and I'm the CEO and founder of Sustainability Consult. I work on credibility and thought leadership, and I've been in Brussels working on environment policy for 20 years. So today's topic is responsible value chains. We're talking about promoting batteries with a high environmental performance. But let me first give you some housekeeping points. This session will be recorded. We'll take your questions during the webinar, so please use the question tab within the app. And hopefully all of our internet connections will allow us to have a smooth and interesting conversation today. But if you do experience any technical problems, just try refreshing your browser, or you can try to dial in by phone. So I'd like to welcome our panelists, and I'll ask each panelist to give me a sign when I introduce them. So firstly, we have Sebastian Röhler from the German battery manufacturer Varta Microbatteries. We're joined by Sophie Tricot from French battery pack manufacturer 4C Power. We have Jan Teitkat from Belgian battery manufacturer or materials manufacturer and recycler Umicore, and Patrick Demetz from the French battery manufacturer Saft. Well, that's a bit of a tongue twister, but let's get ahead to our questions. So today we're talking about environmentally responsible batteries. So how can the European battery industry take a leadership role on environmentally responsible batteries? And anyone would like to answer, please just jump in. If you're not speaking, just mute yourselves.
So maybe I should start with this question. We know that the European Union wants to become climate neutral by 2050, which is of course a very ambitious goal. And if you want to do so, then we need to move to a low emission mobility, and we also have to transform the way how we generate our electricity, our power, so that it's not so much relying or not so much based on carbon. And for this transition, batteries will be necessary. Yeah. So batteries will rechargeable batteries, of course. They will enable this transition. Of course, we can only fulfill these requirements if these batteries that we are using fulfill certain sustainability requirements. Second thing is that if Europe wants to become an industry leader in this battery business, then of course we need to have a legal framework for the whole battery industry, starting from the raw materials throughout the design, the manufacturing, and the application of the batteries up to the end, where the batteries are either refurbished or recycled. So for this, we need to have a framework within Europe. The idea of recharge is to cover this life cycle of the batteries and to make sure that during each phase we can make sure that the batteries are used safe, that they're produced safe, that they can be used safe by the users, by the people, and that all of this is done in a very safe way, in a very efficient way, and that we always know what kind of materials are used, what are the paths that the materials are following. So we need to have this kind of traceability, and these are the items that Recharge is focusing on. Most important, as always said in the beginning, we need to be able to measure the carbon footprint, because this should be our key indicator. Second, of course, we need to have traceability for the materials. Those batteries that have a high impact, they should be recycled, so that they can again be entered into the loop. And of course, if it is an application where this is possible, then it should also be there should be a way that batteries can be either refurbished after they have reached their end of life, or even, if it's possible, to repair in order to improve the environmental impact of that specific battery.
So if I've understood correctly, you've got 4 environmental indicators that you've just gone through there, Sebastian. So the carbon footprint, the traceability of materials, the recycling of high impact materials, and repair and refurbishment. Is that right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, great. Does anybody else want to jump in on this question about how we can show leadership in Europe?
Well, we may want to add something because being a responsible industry is not just about the environment, so it's also about the social performance. And when it comes to the battery industry, what we want to see is that mandatory requirements in terms of social, human, labor rights, and this all along the value chain, so from raw material extraction to the recycling of the material.
So you'd be calling for fixed mandatory requirements for human, social, and labor rights along the value chain. That's quite unusual. Most industries, in Brussels especially, they spend a lot of time saying that there's enough regulation, that there's even too much regulation. It sounds like you're calling for something more. Is that right? Did I understand that right?
Well, it's more, but really, we truly believe that the European industry here has a leadership role to play, and that's something we really want to push.
I see. And are you just talking about the European industry as it operates within Europe, or are you talking also about applying mandatory requirements or regulations to imports of batteries that are made outside of Europe?
Well, that would be all along the value chain. So as long as it's coming into Europe, yes.
Yeah. So if it's on the market, European requirements would apply. Jan, it looks like you'd like to jump in.
I would like to come back on your question, compulsory or not. So I think that indeed the society has the full right to demand minimum standards for sustainability or the quality, etc. So looking, for instance, at the very beginning of the supply chain, so the raw materials, I think it's indeed quite important that as a European Union and as European battery manufacturers, we say, okay, we have some minimum standards that we say they should apply to all. And so level playing field that we say, okay, if we acquire cobalt or nickel or lithium from wherever in the world, there should be minimum standards regarding labor conditions or environmental health and safety conditions for the battery materials that we acquire from outside Europe. And so this is something that should be compulsory for everyone, for all batteries that we produce either in Europe or that we import from outside Europe.
Everything that's put on the market in Europe should have these things taken into account in the value chain. I see. And that would be for the European industry to demonstrate leadership as it does in many sectors. What about carbon footprint? I mean, we've obviously linked batteries to electric mobility and renewable energy generation and storage. The batteries do have an important role to play in making Europe carbon neutral. But we can't ignore the fact that the battery is also something which is made, and it's made of materials, and that takes energy and that takes resources. So what about the battery's own carbon footprint? I'm sure that's not nothing. I have seen some figures. I saw something around 240 million tons of CO2 a year for battery production in Europe. Maybe you could explain a bit about that.
I can say a few words about this. Hopefully the sound connection is working well.
Yes, you're fine.
Thank you. Yeah, the manufacturing of batteries, like any industrial good, requires that things are moved from one place to another, that things are being transformed, heated up and cooled down and assembled. So there is energy manufacturing of batteries like any other object. And so there are emissions linked to those energy uses. The numbers that you have highlighted, yes, this is a rough estimate of the industry's emissions, but you also have to look at the benefits that batteries bring. But before I go into this direction, I'd like to highlight one thing. Manufacturing a battery requires a rather complex supply chain of materials and materials transformation and assembly, all the way to cell manufacturing, and then finally battery assembly of cells. And we have looked at where the impacts are when it comes to CO2 emissions. And surprisingly, approximately 80% of impacts do not occur at cell manufacturing, which is where the key component is made. 80% of impacts actually occur upstream upstream from cell manufacturing, from raw material extraction to transformation to mixing and all the different parts that have to be made before they're assembled into cells. So looking at the CO2 footprint of a battery requires that a thorough focus on the whole supply chain. I just want to, so it's about 80% outside, ahead of the cell manufacturing, and 20% cell manufacturing and battery assembly. Yeah, so, but as my colleagues have said, that the premises of the batteries is that they can help bring decarbonization into the economy, and it is expected that the benefits of batteries are going to be about 10 times greater than their impact when it comes to CO2. This is the rough number, about 1 to 10 ratio. And we would like to make this ratio even better by reducing further the impact of batteries manufacturing when it comes to CO2 emissions. We think a lot can happen in that direction.
Let me jump in here. So the impact of the batteries, so basically the benefit that the batteries has is 10 times greater than its own impact from the manufacturing of the battery, including all the materials extraction. And when we talk about
this is the rough number you have to keep in mind for the largest market of battery use, which is for mobility. It's about a 1 to 10 ratio ballpark figure.
And when you talk about materials extraction, I mean, we're talking about mining of rare elements. I think you talked about cobalt.
We're talking about mining of several different elements, several metals. I mean, we've heard a few metal names: lithium and iron and steel. I mean, not steel, but iron and cobalt and nickel. And yes, indeed, but that's one source of emissions. And then again, the transformation. You know, these materials do not come out of the ground ready to be used by industry. They have to be cleaned up and refined and enhanced and turned into something that's workable. Yeah, and all of this requires energy.
80% of the impact of the emissions is upstream. Are there savings that can be made, and is that within your scope of influence? Can you say that, I want to bring Jan in a second, but can you improve the way that materials are extracted, or is that just out of your sphere of influence?
Well, we cannot, when you are, as my company is in the manufacturing of cells and batteries, yes, we do not indeed operate mines. So we do not directly impact, but through our selection decision and purchasing decision and the messages we carry over to our supply chain, we can certainly give preference to those suppliers who have selected to make those choices that bring the CO2 footprint down in their own operation.
We're talking about value chain here today. So I mean, these kind of responsible sourcing practices by companies will have an impact on reducing the emissions further up the chain. I'd like to bring Jan in. He's definitely got something to add on this point.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yes, indeed, we are upstream compared to SAFT, which is a cell manufacturer. So we are not mining. So we buy the raw materials, we refine and transform them into battery materials. And indeed, this process has an energy demand. But the main energy demand is delivered by electricity. And so by making green electricity contracts, you can indeed reduce your footprint. Of course, you are limited to the amount of green and renewable energy that is available, but we should not wait until there's 100% renewables available to start producing batteries. And so because the curve to grow into electric mobility is step by step and grows slowly. But if we do not start producing batteries today with the electricity mix of today, we will not be ready to have electric vehicles by the time that we have full renewable energy. And so we have to develop that in parallel, and so working on improved and better production processes with renewable energy, and in the meantime developing indeed the renewable energy sources within Europe. So it has to be in parallel.
You can stimulate that growth of renewable energy by requiring it from your suppliers. And for those of you working in companies, you do have that within your power to stimulate the production of renewable energy by creating a demand. Okay, so let's get back to the emissions of the batteries, which Patrick was talking to us about.
Those are not emissions of batteries.
Yeah.
Let me correct this. These batteries do
No,
not
it's the
emit anything.
production.
These are CO2 emissions of the processes that are involved in the manufacturing of the different stages of the battery.
It is the carbon footprint of the final battery if you take a life cycle approach
Yes.
to it. But yeah, the battery itself is not
Yes.
spewing out carbon dioxide or anything, but you have to
no.
entire process.
That was my point.
Yeah, of course. But let's get back to this idea of how much that relationship between the emissions from the process of making the batteries and the emissions that are saved in use. There's a gain there. Do you want to say anything to that, Patrick? So I did interrupt you, and maybe you had something more. Do we still have Patrick?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you hear me okay?
I'm sorry,
Okay.
I lost you there.
I'm just wondering about this kind of gain. Would you talk about a net gain for batteries, maybe? Is that language that you would use?
Yes, I mean, we all have to understand that. Well, let's take again the example of mobility. I mean, clearly, when you place on the market an electrical vehicle rather than a conventional combustion engine vehicle, the object that is placed on the market on day one has a greater CO2 footprint because the object is more sophisticated. There is a big part in it, which is the battery, which to its manufacturing does generate those two emissions. However, during the use of this vehicle, emissions are much reduced through the use of electricity rather than the combustion of gasoline or diesel fuel. And if and car manufacturers have obviously done the math, and the Commission has done the math, and wherever you drive this vehicle, whether it is in high-performing countries where the grid is very efficient when it comes to CO2 footprint, or less performing countries where the grid may not be as efficient, there is indeed a quite significant net gain on the vehicle throughout its use life of about 15 years, typically 15 years, from an electrical vehicle over an internal combustion vehicle. This is the net gain we're talking about here, indeed.
I mean, what about imported batteries? Does it help Europe if electric vehicle batteries are imported? Is there a strong argument to keep that manufacturing in Europe?
The strong argument there is that when we make operations in Europe, whether it is battery assembly, cell manufacturing, or the manufacturing of advanced materials, which to a sizable extent happens in Europe, then the supply chain rests on industrial players who, for the most part, are more efficient or much more efficient than their competitors outside of Europe. So for large part of the supply chain, obviously not the mines, because to some extent, Europe cannot do without non-European mines. To some extent, it can, but not. It still needs non-European mines. So for all of these stages, besides mining, having operations in Europe is a way to significantly reduce footprint of the batteries and start with a better day one impact than by having battery where the main manufacturing steps were non-European.
I need to come to Jan here because I was wondering about the recycling of materials. You don't necessarily have to mine everything fresh every time.
But before entering into the discussion on the recycling, I would like also to add some other dimensions of sustainability. Sustainability is, of course, about the environmental footprint, but it's also about social aspects. And so if you look at the production of cars in general today, it's quite European. And the Commission has clearly decided or issued a communication including technology sovereignty. So I think that we cannot substitute our actual cars with all imported cars or imported batteries. So it's absolutely necessary also from the social dimension that we replace to a certain extent the existing car manufacturing by battery manufacturing and electric vehicle manufacturing. So this is also a social aspect that's quite important to add to the sustainability discussion. So now coming to your question on recycling, And so if you look at the growth curves of batteries that will be needed now in 2030, that will grow exponentially, so that it's a very fast growing. And recycling, so luckily those batteries have a long life. So they live for 10 years or longer, and maybe then after the first use in a car, they can extend their life in a stationary application. So before recycling will become a significant contributor to the raw materials, we will need to build up a stock of critical raw materials in our European batteries. So it's important that we develop the recycling industry clearly, but at the same time that we have a connection to very sustainable and durable supply of primary raw materials. So that's an important aspect. Yeah. So, but in the meantime, we need to develop good recycling infrastructure.
Does that mean that the recycling is not there yet in Europe? We haven't got what?
Not yet. We have the technology. So the European recyclers have developed already a lot of flow sheets and processes, but they are all in infancy. So they are all small scale recycling. But if we have to build this capacity by 2030, then we have to be ready to cope with maybe 1 million of batteries to be recycled, whereas today it's expressed in some thousands a year. And so we will have to follow this curve, this growth curve, but with a delay of 10-15 years.
So the vision is there for 10 to 15 years. Yes, Sebastian.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So I would like to comment on two things that have been discussed now. So your question was, Catherine, what can the battery manufacturers do to improve the carbon footprint? And the other question was, why do we need all that battery value chain inside Europe? And let me give you one comment that somehow reflects on both of these questions. So so Patrick also already has mentioned that the influence that the battery manufacturer can do on the carbon footprint generated during the production of the battery is limited to maybe only 20%. But what we can do is, so of course we can work on that 20%, but then also we can work on how long this battery can be used in the field. So if we make the batteries last longer, so if it doesn't have to be replaced maybe after 5 years, but even after 10 years, then this will double the environmental performance of the battery, because you only have to produce it once. Yeah. And for this, we need to have research inside Europe. We need to have all the players in the battery value chain follow the same direction, and this can only be done if all of them have a strong, if they are strongly available inside Europe, following these European ambitions, these European goals.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I mean, I'm happy to hear also industries talking about the social dimension, because we sometimes forget that sustainability is about environmental, economic, and social. And it's very often the environmental that is focused, and the other social aspects tend to be forgotten very often. So let's talk a bit more about recycling. Now, if I've understood correctly, there's no regulation now for lithium-based batteries, because when the regulation was set, the lithium batteries were only really starting to come through. So there's a current recycling efficiency target of 50%, which applies to these other batteries category in the directive. So it's all a bit confusing. I was hoping that, Sophie, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how this works and what that will mean for lithium batteries in the future.
Sure. Well,
Sophie?
Can you hear me?
Yes, it's fine. There was a little delay, but I hear you.
Can you hear me fine?
Oh, it's okay.
Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, it's okay.
So maybe it's worth explaining a little bit of the actual battery directives. So it's the actual dates back to 2006. And in the directive, there were 3 main categories. The first one is portable batteries. There's one for automotive batteries, but this includes starting and for the lighting of the vehicle. And then there's a third category, which is industrial batteries. And back then, with this category, you had 3 subcategories. One was for lead acid, one nickel cadmium, and one for others. And actually, the lithium-based batteries fell into the others category, which had the lowest recycling efficiency target. So really, the situation has changed a lot. It's not only emerging, it's really booming. So we really need to set dedicated targets for lithium-based batteries. We need to set higher target, but also better targets, because when you approach recycling, you really need to have this circular economy approach. It means that you want to increase the environmental profile, but you also want to increase the circularity of the material and of the relevant materials. So that's something we really need to study. And if you look at it, so then you look at those materials, you want to analyze what's inside the battery, and also assess the impact of the different materials. And once we've done that, we can set the right target on the right materials. That's what we need to do now with these.
Thank you, Sophie. Is there an agreement on what those recycling targets should be?
If I may jump in here, thank you. I think that we have to understand that the battery chemistry is still evolving. And so today we talk about NMC, so nickel, manganese, cobalt in a ratio 1 to 1 to 1, but it's going to move into the direction of 8-1-1, so more nickel, less cobalt, less manganese. So that means that all recycling processes will need to be flexible or robust so that they can cope with a variety of battery chemistries. So that means that if you would have very strict recycling targets on one or another element, and then the amount of that element would be reduced in the future batteries, then these very rigid targets might be not the best approach. So therefore, as in Recharge, we are pleading rather for a set of elements that we say, okay, the cluster of those most important elements, they should reach a certain level of recycling. And so within that cluster, we think mainly about lithium, cobalt, nickel. These are by far the most important elements in terms of supply, security of supply. And just to give one example and why it's important to develop this recycling industry. So if you look at lithium production of today and what we expect we will need in the future, then it's anticipated that by 2025-26, Europe alone would already need the full world production of lithium of today. And so that means that if we can recycle and develop the recycling technologies for lithium, that we will have an additional source of lithium to produce European batteries. And so it's important, as I said already in the beginning, to develop both the primary production of materials, but also to make sure that those critical materials that are essential for the batteries, that we really recover them for future.
Well, it's interesting when you say flexibility, because we're talking about legislation, and flexibility in legislation that almost feels counterproductive or counterintuitive. So how, in practical terms, could flexibility work in terms of the, we've lost Jan, I'm trying to ask him, but if anyone else has a view on that, how would a flexible target actually work in legislation? And is there an openness with the Commission to have a flexible target? And he's on his way back. Here you are.
Yeah, I was kicked out for one or another technical reason, but I understand your question. So is there flexibility from the Commission? So as already mentioned earlier, the Commission is in the revision process for the Batteries Directive. So it's now really an opportunity to talk with the Commission and with people from the civil society as well, to look what would be the best targets to reflect in legislation, and to make sure that at the same time we keep this flexibility to optimize and to ensure that today will be suited for recycling of the batteries of within 10 years. And so that's one objective. And on the other hand, the objective of having access to the critical raw materials that we need to produce new batteries. And so I think it's not a conflicting interest. We have just to find an optimized definition of what could be the best way to collect, what is the best way to set targets, and to ensure that those materials that need to be refined to the level of battery grade, that they really go back to batteries.
And I'm wondering if there's a precedent maybe in other sectors where technology is developing really rapidly, and there might be a precedent there where you can say, you know, there's a principle of recycling, but that it has to evolve. We sometimes see sort of recycling for the sake of recycling, and this idea, which we talked about in the last roundtable, that more is not necessarily better, but that it actually has to make sense environmentally. Patrick?
I'd like to add one quick comment on this questions regarding flexibility. I mean, the way these recycling efficiency targets are set today already are rather flexible, in the sense that they do not specify how the targets need to be met. When Sophie introduced the 50% that is already in place for lithium batteries, the legislation does not say how that 50% should be met. All it says is 50%. And actually, our proposal is to focus a little more those targets on those key elements. Jan was speaking about lithium, and keep the flexibility to get that, to that number.
Because this is indeed something that people that are not quite familiar with the legislation should know as well. And so a lithium-ion battery, if you look at cell level, consists of 40% of elements like oxygen and carbon and hydrogen. So it's not important to recycle those elements. What's the contribution to the circular economy if you recycle oxygen? And that's what we propose now within RECHARGE. That is that we would focus on the more critical materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and so that's important. It's not important to recycle oxygen.
And so during the course of this year, that directive is being revised, and I guess you'll get your answers on how
we hope so.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We had a question actually from the last webinar that we didn't have time to take, and I wanted to bring it now because it is still relevant to this topic, and it's a question about waste. Somebody asked how we can limit the export of battery waste. Is there anything that can be done about that? And even should waste exports be limited? Yeah, Jan, please.
Yeah, I think indeed, well, there are different values that are important, and free trade is also an important value in the economy. But what we have already in the existing batteries directive is that batteries which are exported outside Europe and for recycling outside Europe, that they have to be recycled under equivalent conditions as in Europe. But it is not specified what are these conditions. And so we are pleading indeed for, okay, if they are recycled outside Europe, then they should meet recycling standards, and not just the recycling efficiency targets, but also, for instance, environmental health and safety targets, or exposure of occupational health rules. That is also important. It's not nice, it's not human that we say, okay, recycling in Europe should be under these occupational conditions, and then if it is exported, that we say, okay, that's your problem. So I think that we have to be responsible for our waste, and that we have to make sure that it is recycled in the proper way. So that's one major element that we need to develop.
Yeah,
another point is that we have to look at the concept of hazardous waste. So more and more economies do not accept imports of foreign hazardous waste or waste in general. And I think that we have to look at that as well and say, okay, as an economy, as Europe, we have to be able to treat our own waste that we should not consider as just waste, but as the resource for producing new battery materials.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, regardless of like any principles of free trade, if we do want to protect the environment and the social conditions, as you've said, exposure of workers, emissions from recycling facilities and waste management facilities, isn't it better to keep that in Europe, where we have stricter legislation and we have a proper overview of what's happening?
Well, of course, if there is a legal instrument to keep the waste in Europe, we would prefer to do that because it's our urban mine. It's our way to get access to the raw materials. But if it is exported, then we have to make sure that it is treated in a proper way. So we know the examples of exported waste of electronic and electric equipment that is dumped in some Western African countries, and there it's treated in a way that it's not acceptable. It's not human. So we have to avoid that same scenario with batteries.
Yeah, and this is really the challenge. I'm not going to stay with this for too long, but that waste is being dumped, waste is being burned and not properly treated. Does anybody have a final comment on this? And if not, we're going to move to a poll. Patrick?
Yeah, I think having the option to recycle waste outside of the union is of interest, but should be open, but indeed should be only conducted when equivalent conditions are implemented in those countries. Yes, so free trade, yes, but equivalent conditions
and the value chain that's responsible socially and environmentally. Okay, we are going to launch a poll now. So if you look within the app, you should see the question. If you had to choose one, what would be the most relevant environmental indicator for a sustainable battery value chain? And your choices are resource efficiency, carbon footprint, high impact recycling, restriction of hazardous substances, second life, and reuse. I'm not going to vote because I'm the moderator, but I'd invite all of the participants to cast their vote. And maybe I have to vote to see what people's answers are. I don't see the numbers.
You have to vote to see the results.
I just lost my position of neutrality. Carbon footprint. There we go.
We even know what your vote is.
So 40, when it's still moving, people are still voting. We'll give you another minute or so to get the votes in. But certainly carbon footprint is leading the way in this race, followed by high impact recycling. Now, we talked a lot about recycling in the last webinar, so I'd also direct people to go and check that out. Hazardous substances, people don't seem to be, well, they're either not worried about them or they don't think that it's the most important environmental indicator. Let's basically say that it's carbon footprint, and right behind carbon footprint, a little behind high impact recycling. Does that stimulate anyone on the panel to comment? Any thoughts?
Yeah, if I may, I just want to remark here that resource efficiency, recycling, and second to life, that is one cluster. In fact, it's all about the use of materials. And indeed, I think indeed that the way how we deal with materials, it's quite important. So if you can do more with less, either by having other materials or by efficient, so as Sebastian said, longer life of the materials, that's all resource efficiency. And so I think indeed it's an important parameter. And then the other one is indeed carbon footprint, which we have discussed already. So. But on the hazardous substances, there is indeed a concern in society about the use of hazardous substances. But don't forget that all the substances in a battery have a function. They are not there just for the pleasure. So they have a function. And if this function can be done with non-hazardous compounds, we will certainly do that. But if the hazardous compound has a result in, let's say, a longer lifetime or a more efficient energy conversion, then we have to make a balance of what is the negative impact of that hazardous compound versus the positive impact on longer lifetime or resource efficiency.
And we've talked about it on the other roundtables, but I mean, a battery is a closed unit. I mean, I've definitely learned something during this process. It's a closed unit. We're not opening them up at the dinner table. But I take your point, Jan, and if we would combine resource efficiency, high impact recycling, and second life and reuse categories, we get 57%. And so then you're muted, Jan, and then people are voting for that cluster of resource efficiency elements more than carbon footprint. Okay, so that's the poll. We do seem to have lost Sophie. We're hoping that she'll be able to join us again. We've had a few shaky connections, but let's keep going regardless. Patrick, I had a question for you about single-use products. Now, most of us in Brussels are aware probably of the Commission's desire to phase out single-use products, and it's very much about plastics. It's driven by the plastics agenda and not wanting to have as much throwaway materials, not wanting to have as much waste, and then trying to, Sophie, hi, she's back with us, and having a more circular view on how we use materials, which we've touched on already today. But how do batteries fit within this single-use philosophy of the Commission?
Yeah, well, we certainly hear messages from the Commission who would like industry to move away from so-called single-use products. Everyone, of course, has in mind the single-use diaper that is just used once. And by the way, these products seem to be a little bit out of fashion today, indeed. When it comes to batteries, I mean, all of us may think about the battery we have in our television remote control or our flashlight, which for the most of us are indeed single-use batteries, and whether those it wouldn't be a better solution to use rechargeable batteries. And I'll let everyone here, have his own opinion on this. What we would like to share here at Recharge is that there are single-use batteries. There are industrial single-use batteries, which are not very well known by the general public, but play quite an important role for several industries. And typically, these are products that, in a way, are single-use, but their use can be as long as 20 years, and they will be used every day and pretty much several times a day over 365 days over 20 years. Kind of I'm not sure this is really a single-use product. This is a very long life product.
Can you give us an example of what type of products this might be, just for people that are not familiar with industrial batteries? What type of equipment or appliance would it be that uses this kind of battery for 20 years?
I think Patrick's got an issue, but maybe I can answer that. For example, you can, on rail tracks, you have like safety phones, and these can be batteries that are included for a very long time in those devices, or emergency exits, or you also have some that needs to be super reliability, such as in defibrillators, for example. So there are, different applications. Batteries back.
Surely the Commission does not think that a defibrillator or an emergency exit sign is a throwaway application. It's not like a water bottle or a plastic packaging of something.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we need to convey. There are, critical single-use products that will last typically those lengths of time. A good example, another good example, is all these smart meters that are installed in on the network side of many households, where water usage or electricity usage or gas usage is now tracked using a little chip, and that little chip is powered by a little single-use battery, which again will work for 15 or 20 years and will last as long as the meter lasts. So these need
leading to think of these as single-use. If something lasts for 20 years, it's not single-use.
Yeah. Well, maybe the word is not properly selected here, and
so
would have to be reworded
to the Commission, I'm sure. Okay, let's talk about environmental performance of batteries, because you're all from battery companies or material manufacturers. Maybe Sebastian, you could talk to this, but we've talked about maybe having mandatory requirements for standards across the value chain, but what about mandatory performance criteria? You already said that if a battery can last another 5 years, then obviously its impact is reduced over time. So what about mandatory performance criteria? Could you speak to that, Sebastian?
Yeah, so thank you, Catherine, for that question. I think here we should keep in mind that there is a market for these batteries, and that there are consumers that at the end decide which kind of batteries they want to have, what kind of product with what kind of batteries they are going to buy, and why don't we let the market decide? So if we put up rules on how batteries have to be designed, this will remove the flexibility. And as Jen already mentioned, yeah, we need to have this flexibility because we do not know today what batteries in 10 years will look like. So maybe we will have a totally different technology than what we have today, or maybe we have another kind of market, we have another kind of demand for such batteries, and all this flexibility would be lost or reduced if there is a strong regulation. So let me add one point here, which might be even important for those people who are not so much into the battery topic. So you know, batteries are everywhere. You have it in your smartphone. You have it in all those devices that we already mentioned, like those life-sustaining devices. But we also have it in. Oh, I think my mic was muted for a second. So we also have it in very large applications, such as large energy storage systems, and all those batteries are used in a somewhat different way, and this specific battery needs to be tailored for that specific application. And all of that would be impossible if you don't have the flexibility for the designers. So I think that's maybe the most important point here. And at the end, we need to enable the customers to decide on what kind of batteries they want to buy, and carbon footprint might be one option here. So because this is something that is today very well understood, so there need to be rules on how this carbon footprint is calculated, and then this should be the most important indicator for the customer to decide on what kind of battery he wants to have.
It seems like it's a constant challenge within the Brussels environment, within legislation anyway. You need to leave room for technology to develop, for emerging technologies, and you need to have a comprehensive regulatory framework. So I mean, that is the challenge that we deal with constantly in Brussels. I'm going to try to take a question from the audience, unless anybody else wants to come in on those last points. Is there anything else? Okay, I know we have a lot of questions, so just give me a second to go through and find something suitable. So what about this? Minimum standards and creating a level playing field for environmental performance for all players seems like a good approach. What would these standards look like? Would it be maybe a blacklist of practices or mandatory standards around due diligence? That's a question from the audience. So maybe you could add something on this around how to create a level playing field and what those standards might look like. Anyone who'd like to come?
Yes, maybe I can say a few words about this. I understand the question being related to standards along the supply chain. Is that the way the question is framed? Because I can't see it myself.
Minimum standards and creating a level playing field for environmental performance for all players. It doesn't specify the value chain, but I think as we're talking about value chain today, we could apply that.
Let's assume that's the intent behind the question. I mean, clearly, when you look at your value chain and how the value chain implements, CSR principles, you have essentially two main areas. You have all the issues related to social. How do companies interact with their workers and interact with the community around their facilities and in the countries and areas where they operate? And then you have issues related to environmental performance of their operations, essentially. Let's say a couple of words about social issues and how these companies interact with their workforce. I mean, there are several sets of standards on how to properly work with your employees and treat your employees. Some have been written in the context of United Nations agencies such as the ILO, the International Labour Organization, that has set several minimum standards in many areas regarding worker protection, insurance, disability protection, child labor protection, fairness between male and women and female employees. So there's already a pretty strong.
That's on the social side. What about the environmental side? Because the question he was asking specifically about environmental performance. And Sebastian, you just talked about environmental performance. Do you feel that there are maybe some standards that should be brought forward that would support getting the best performance possible from batteries on the European market?
Well, again, the key indicator is the carbon footprint. Yeah, and if this covers the whole life cycle, starting from raw material, ending up with refurbishment or recycling, then all of this should be covered.
Yeah, I mean, quite indicated for environmental standards and environmental protection. There are other impacts.
Maybe just to add something here. So as batteries and the electric mobility is still in the early stage of development, we have to be prudent not to impose standards too early. What we first need is transparency. So we first have to have a common communication tool on the performance, the environmental performance first. And so it's only when we agree how to measure and how to express the results that we can communicate, and then we can go to standards. So that's the first thing that should happen. And I see that the Commission is already working on this kind of tools. So people that are maybe more familiar with the words in the Commission. So the product environmental footprint is a technology that has been developed and that we have already been working on for batteries, but it needs to be refined to make it better and more appropriate to express the environmental footprint of batteries. So we first need to develop the tools in a correct way. I think this is the first before we start talking about standards.
And when you say transparency, do you also mean that should apply to imports?
Absolutely. So there should not be made a distinction between batteries produced in Europe and batteries imported from abroad. So we need to develop this common language and to express the performance in a uniformed way so that the consumer can really compare and estimate what is the impact of his choice. And so I said in the previous session, we cannot build a clean mobility on dirty batteries. And so we really need to ensure that the batteries which are entering the European market, either because they're produced in Europe or because they are imported, that we have some minimum information, and then building on that minimum information, also going to minimum requirements.
And one of the questions from the audience, another question is about the systems for reporting the carbon footprint. It's maybe a bit technical question. You might not have an answer, but is there a system that you favor as Recharge or as individual companies for reporting on the CO2 footprint of, for example, EV batteries?
Well, as I mentioned already, the product environmental footprint. So it's not a perfect tool. It has to be improved. And within Recharge, we are taking a lead here to mold it into a way that it is more suited for the purpose. But that is, for as far as I know, and I'm asking my colleagues, they would agree, but the product environmental footprint is so far the only tool that has been developed within.
Maybe I can say a couple of words on this. I mean, we, as industry in the battery world, whether we make cells or whether we make equipment or whether we make components or materials that go into batteries, we have a good view of who are the different players and where the impacts can be, and how those impacts should be accounted for, and how they should be accounted for and added together to get to the impact of the final product. However, I'm not so sure that we are specialists on how to go about setting up a system to capture that information. I mean, there are industries whose job is exactly to do that. And I think on this, we should probably rely on those specialists who can set up information capturing and aggregation systems.
I mean, that's the whole sustainability industry of its own, as you say.
yeah, it's a whole
One
issue
of the
itself.
things that's really important to the Commission at the moment is circular economy, and we've touched on it in all of the roundtable discussions. And one of the initiatives in the Circular Economy Action Plan from the Commission is to create a toxic-free or so-called toxic-free environment. Obviously, materials management and sourcing and all of that is a big deal for you as an industry. So what would this toxic-free environment mean for the battery industry? Is it somehow positive, or would it actually stop you from making batteries altogether?
Well, it depends what is meant behind the word toxic-free. First of all, we have to go back a little bit into basics here, and I'd like to build on what Jan was saying a few minutes ago. We choose the components that go into the batteries to make sure that they can deliver the performance that is expected from the market. We do not choose components or substances that are intrinsically hazardous because we like them. We choose them because they allow the products to deliver the required level of performance. If we were to choose other substances that would not deliver the same amount of performance, we would not be able to satisfy the demands of the customers. So it is a selection. And some of that selection process goes with substances that indeed have some element of toxicity that makes them classified under European legislation, and they have to be managed very well. I think it is our duty to ensure that throughout every life cycle phase of those products, the risks are properly and completely controlled. We have already established that batteries are closed units, they're sealed units, and they do not release anything, whether it is CO2 or any other chemical during their life. So when it comes to use, we know that batteries do not generate any sort of impact of that sort. And it is clearly our duty as manufacturer, whether it's the manufacturing of the battery, of the cell, or the components, to make sure that in the plants we have the proper worker protection, and we're back to that whole discussion on supply chain management, and also what it is that we do in our plants to make sure that our people are, very well protected. And we have a very thorough legislative background here in Europe to help us with that. Likewise, end of life. This is exactly why the Batteries Directive was created in the first place. Make sure that batteries are collected at the end of the life and recycled by operators who also follow those strict European conditions or equivalent conditions if we are to work with non-European recyclers. So a toxic-free environment, I think, is an environment where we can use the substances for the benefits they bring, whilst making sure that they do not seep into the environment or into the workplaces, and the hazards are properly controlled.
Let's get real, because that's already the case. You're already making batteries, it's already controlled. We've already got, decent standards of social protection, of environmental protection in Europe. So if you could just continue even with those standards, you can still make batteries and you can support the electrification of mobility and all the rest of it. I'm not here as an advocate for your industry. I'm just asking the question. Does anything need to change in terms of toxic-free or chemicals management for battery industry?
Well, I mean, as science moves forward, and as technology knows better, as science knows better the impact of substances, we do realize that substances which were believed to be, hazard-free 10 years ago may, after all, after careful reconsideration, pose certain specific hazards, and therefore there has to be the necessary adjustments based on the recent science to make sure that, as the radar constantly screens those substances that are either natural or manufactured by man for their properties, the framework is constantly adjusted.
Yep.
this is really a process that needs to continue evolving over time, and it does live and evolves over time, and it needs to continue that direction.
But that feels a bit like legislation as usual. That makes sense, right? That's normal within the legislation. But I'm thinking about the Circular Economy Action Plan. If there is this push to really have a toxic-free environment, it makes me wonder if you'd still be able to manufacture batteries. But Jan, I'd love to bring you in on it.
I see it's close to closing time, so I just wanted to add an element. If it's about closing the loop and the risks associated with batteries, I think it's not the hazardous compounds that is the most risky parts of the batteries, but it's the management at the end of life. There, that batteries were in a storage area and then have to transport it to a recycling or a refurbishing plant. There are risks, especially when the batteries are damaged. And so the transport of hazardous waste today is hampering the transport of the batteries towards a recycling or a refurbishment plant. So we have to work there to make sure that the batteries which are out of use are going as fast as possible under safe conditions to a recycling or a refurbishment plant. And the transport rules for hazardous waste are hampering this transport instead of facilitating. So we have to work there more than on the hazardous compounds as such.
Okay, I mean, they feel like legislation that's outside of the circular economy. I'll bring Sebastian in just a second. That feels like existing legislation that is relevant to your industry rather than maybe being part of the circular economy strategy. But Sebastian, what would you like to add?
Yeah, just a very short comment to what Jan and Patrick already said in order to make sure that we are not misunderstood. Yeah. So of course there are substances in a battery that might be considered toxic, and Jan and Patrick explained that they are there for a reason. But still, if it is possible to reduce or to remove or to substitute some substances that are considered toxic, of course we do that. Yeah. So many of us know that some years ago we had batteries containing mercury. Yeah, and this for most of the batteries, this mercury has been completely removed because it was technically possible. Of course, this was an effort and it was a challenge, but the battery industry managed to do so. And there might be other areas where we can remove these substances that are considered toxic. But we should not go for batteries that are toxic free just because of the word, yeah, just because it's nice to have a product that is toxic free, especially if there is no exposition to the environment or to the users or to the workers of this toxic substance.
And that's where in Europe we do have good legislation. I'm sure it can always be better. Right. Everything can always be improved, right? So of course, there is a leadership position in Europe for legislation that the rest of the world looks to. Whether or not that's circular economy or not, I'm not sure. That feels like regular regulation for the battery industry. And we are here today talking about a responsible value chain. So that kind of rounds it off quite nicely. I do just want to give Sophie the opportunity because we can't see her. She might be desperate to say something. Sophie, is there anything that you would like to add as we round off today's discussion? If she can hear me. Sophie? Okay. In which case, then, I would like to thank you for joining and thank all of our panelists. This is now the end of the virtual roundtable. The replay will be made available. And you are able to follow Recharge. So we'd like to see you at other events, but you can also follow Recharge on Twitter and LinkedIn and at the website rechargebatteries.org. So that concludes today's webinar. Thanks again for joining and have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.